Hello and welcome to our listeners and our viewers to this very special section of our podcast, The Big Interview. It is with great pleasure that I now get to introduce Matt Alder. Matt has got the best job title. It's a job title I would quite like to have, Matt. Talent Acquisition Futurist. Matt has a wealth of experience. He's a world-famous consultant, a fantastic podcaster, and he knows a hell of a lot about building people teams, talent teams, and the HR function. Matt, very warm welcome to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
And I think the pleasure will be all ours. And the reason I was so excited to speak to you, Matt, is because obviously we live in a world of technology and artificial intelligence and containers. And I think we sometimes live in the tech industry in a bubble. So we're all grateful that you can come and give us a different perspective, give us the HR perspective essentially on the world as we currently find it.
Sure.
So, Matt, I wanted to start by asking you about artificial intelligence in the hiring process. And there seems to be a schism in my world. And the schism is something like this. Some people think using tools in an interview, a technical interview, is cheating. And they're not being quiet about this. They're being extremely vocal. They say things like, if you need an AI, you're not a real programmer, you're not a real engineer. On the other hand, using tools, generative AI tools, for example, as part of your day-to-day job as a computer programmer or an accountant or a lawyer is an essential skill. So I was wondering, what is your opinion or take on that one?
Yeah, it's a really big topic, and it's something that's applying to all industries, really. And it's interesting because in a lot of respects, the job seekers and the candidates are actually ahead of the employers when it comes to using AI in the recruiting process. So many companies are seeing the amount of applications that they're getting for roles just going through the roof at the moment. Now, some of that is because of the economic factors. There are less jobs around, more people being laid off, those kind of things. But a lot of it is because if you use AI in your application process, you can apply to a huge amount of jobs at once. So, we're seeing it being used for people to apply to jobs, and as you say, people using it in various sort of different types of assessment, either covertly or overtly. And it's a big dilemma because it kind of breaks recruiting as we know it, and a lot of the tools and processes in recruiting have been the same for about 200 years. So we've been using CVs and interviews and all of these kind of things for a really, really, really long time. And I know that you've done a lot of work on the kind of the history of this kind of thing. And it hasn't really changed and it hasn't really adapted, and we're sort of at that point now. So I'm not surprised that there are lots of kind of arguments about this. But ultimately, I think we need to find a different way of doing things. And I suppose to come back to your question about coding tests and people using AI and all that kind of stuff, I think that it's going to come down to what do people need in the job. As you said, there are specific AI skills that are needed, and then other companies, they don't want to use AI for certain things. And I think rather than having the same old sort of generic approaches to recruiting, companies are going to have to kind of reflect that in how they assess people, and that's going to be that will be different from company to company, I'm sure. So in some ways it's not even a debate, because if a company wants to do it one way, then they do it another way. I think more generally, I think companies that are saying we do not allow AI in our application process are just deluding themselves, because firstly, why would you limit people with AI skills coming into your business when it's kind of one of the most important the skills that we need? But also it's pretty much undetectable in lots and lots of ways. So I think there's a big sort of rethink coming in terms of that sort of candidate side of things. I also think a lot of people are writing it off as a fad or a trend or cheating, but this is as a fad or cheating, but this is a trend, and the candidates are setting the pace here. 100%.
We had a discussion at Container Solutions about this, and we expected it to be controversial and huge, and we'd all be arguing with each other. And we all quickly came to the conclusion, if you're using a number of tools in your day job, then you need to show you're proficient in them. So why wouldn't you be using them as part of the interview process? And these generative AI tools are simply another tool. And so while all the snobs are out there saying, we're not going to do this, well, you're going to basically, your talent pipeline will freeze for 6 or 12 months until you catch up with the world. But in the meantime, all your competitors are going to move on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that so many companies have these conversations internally, but they never say what their policy is. So they don't say when they're talking about their recruitment processes or looking for candidates, our policy on AI is this. We want you to use it for this bit. We don't want you to use it for this bit. Because there's another aspect to this. There's the aspect of candidates using it to augment their application. There's two other things. There's people who are using it to fake their skills and ability, and then there's kind of outright fraud. We're seeing a lot of kind of fake applications with deep fake videos and all these kind of things where bad actors are trying to defraud companies by getting into their systems. So there's a lot to it, and I think having a kind of clear policy on it is just kind of really, really essential. So you don't sort of confuse those three things. I think that's one of the big issues.
How do companies get around that? Does this mean the company receiving applicants might start using AI to filter out other AI applicants? What is the solution there? Because I saw something on social media the other day, and a poor recruiter had, there was a number of questions, and 10 or 20 or even 30 odd applicants answered with identical words because they'd all asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT gave a convincing answer. So the user was like, yes, that's a great answer. But 30 users had been given the same advice. What does the recruiter do in a situation like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure anyone's got a definitive answer to it at the moment. I mean, I'd start by saying that, using AI tools in the recruiting process isn't necessarily always about trying to spot AI. I think one of the big advantages that we're seeing with some of the kind of the ethical AI recruiting tools that are out there is the ability to screen a huge amount of candidates very, very quickly and actually find find the best people. So if 2,000 people apply for a job and there's one recruiter looking at it, they're not going to be able to to go through every single kind of one of those applications in detail, but an AI can. Now, obviously, if you've got this situation where everyone has got the same response, I think again having a clear policy is a good way. But you really need to rethink the process, and there's different directions to go in. So some companies are there are tools out there that are being developed that, particularly when people are doing video interviews and things like that, can kind of they allege they can kind of recognize when someone's cheating by what they're doing. I've seen a few of those tools. Other companies are going really old school and having people do tests on site or under supervision. And then some companies are just kind of rethinking what it is that they're actually looking for and what are they testing. One of the best examples, actually, I had someone on my podcast a few weeks ago who works in the Middle East, and he's an ex-academic. I think he's a professor in telecommunications or technology or something, and he's now become an AI-powered recruiter. And what he does is he uses his AI system to kind of evaluate, rank candidates and all that sort of stuff. But then because he's recruiting for quite senior roles, he then talks to those people. He talks to them and he talks through the results that they've got. He looks to see, is there anything missing? Is there anything that in this very limited framework of a CV that we're misinterpreting or you haven't put out there? And he's kind of getting some great results from doing that. So it's a real, there isn't a definitive answer. It's a combination of things, but I think really understanding what is it that I want to get out of this recruitment process, what are we really looking for? What is it that we're really looking for?
So it forces you to think.
I think that's the thing. And I think also one of the things that we're very guilty of in recruiting is we'll moan that we get too many applications, that we get candidates cheating with AI. But very often the quality of the job advert or the job description that goes out is poor and generic, and the recruitment process is very generic as well. So I think that there are recruiters need to take a long look at what they're doing that might be contributing to this, particular problem as well.
Now, you just described a fantastic use case. Generative AI is brilliant for filtering through tons of data. Now, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news at this point, Matt, but the problem is those models are trained on historical data. And so, for example, if you've trained your model on a company where, for whatever reason, toxic men were promoted for whatever, because their culture was rotten, that model will embody that rotten culture and then perpetrate it into the future. And what I mean by that is it will select candidates that look like previous successful candidates. And this is something hidden, I think, from many people's consciousness. And that is quite scary as a concept, because essentially diversity and diversity of thought in your companies will be reduced by over-reliance on these tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just ethically scary, it's legally scary as well. So this is a huge kind of issue that's going on in the recruiting space at the moment. So, we know the power of AI to pattern match, to deal with huge amounts of data. But as you say, and people have run, tests on this, the kind of the LLMs that power this are all biased in different ways, already kind of out of the gate. At the same time, there is more and more kind of scrutiny on this area. So, we're seeing class actions coming in the States. We're seeing the European AI Act. We're seeing a lot of kind of scrutiny and people looking at this. So, what's been interesting is that there's a real drive towards how can we make AI fair in this part of the process. And there's some great companies out there who are doing a huge amount of work to do that. There are a couple of companies that are out auditing, those bits of software to sort of check for fairness. So it's something that is happening. But as you say, I think if people kind of rely on tools they've already got without that kind of specialist input and that auditing, then they are going to get those kind of results. It's an interesting area for recruiting at the moment. And I think that the work that's being done to mitigate bias is interesting. But I think the other thing as well is what we're also doing is we're holding machines, we're giving more accountability, machines to a higher standard of accountability than we are to humans, which, if you think about it, is interesting as well.
I mean, I've said previously that these models may be biased and they may be rotten, but they're a lot less rotten than some of the executives I've crossed paths with.
Exactly.
And so the outcomes could be better. Now, earlier you said two things, Matt. You said AI in a way breaks the world for recruitment, but then you mentioned another two words, old school. I recently met a professor of computer science, wonderful gentleman, and he suggested as AI becomes indistinguishable from real life, so with deep fakes, whether that's video, voice, podcasting, he said people will start to pay for newspapers again and pay for high quality journalism again, because that will be the only way you've got an authentic source. And I remember thinking, I'd not considered that previously. I thought, oh wow, so AI could lead to the resurgence of old school face-to-face techniques.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's funny because all the way through the sort of the internet revolution in recruiting, we've always talked about old skill recruiting skills.
Right.
And old skill recruiting skills are the things that used to happen all the time before we had the internet and email, which was people building trust and relationships with each other. Right. And I think if you take that and add in the technology to do that at scale, then, I think I'm very optimistic about this, because I think ultimately we're going to get to much better recruiting and much better hiring, but it's a very rocky road on the way, which is, what we're kind of, we're not even in the middle of it at the moment. We're at the start of it at the moment, but I'm optimistic about the actual outcome.
Absolutely. So when things change, usually they change on average for the better, but of course you have winners and you have losers. And right now, the people who are potentially losing are feeling that and they're complaining. Now, let's look at this from a different angle, Matt. So we've talked about AI within the hiring process, But clearly right now there are more people unemployed because of the use of technology. Some people are saying, well, businesses are using this as an excuse to barter down wages. But the truth is that there are a lot of people out there, more people looking for work than probably any time in the last 20 years. Do you see this as a temporary thing, or do you see this as a genuine shift? And if so, what are people to do about it?
Yeah, it's the million dollar question. I think at the moment it's a slightly confusing picture because I think that there are a lot of organizations that have used AI as an excuse to to kind of resize their organizations. So I think we're looking at a slightly artificial picture. However, it's very clear that AI is already digging into certain types of job and those kind of things. So I think this is a big issue. I don't think that the governments are on top of this in the way that they should be. And also, I think that some companies are thinking very short term. Because if you one of the areas that we've seen kind of suffering the most is entry level hiring. And ultimately, if we get to a point where there isn't a workforce because no one under a certain age could get a job, that's not good for the longevity of any business. So I think that's another issue.
So with entry level planning, just to stop you there for one moment, Matt, because I want to expand on that a little bit. So with entry level stuff, for example, especially in legal law firms and accounting firms, all of a sudden the stuff that a junior would do has been done by a computer. But then how do they do succession? So when the middle level managers become partners and then the partners retire, who will then replenish the workforce if that first step hasn't been taken? I thought that was terrifying because how does the system continue if it's essentially a chain, isn't it? It's a link. And now we've taken a link out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it in various industries in the past where, particularly in the energy industry, sometimes there was there'd be a big kind of recession and a scale back in entry level hiring, and then 5 to 10 years later there is a massive skill shortage of middle and senior weight people. I think ultimately the way companies probably need to think about this slightly differently, because what is it that AI is actually taking away? It's not actually taking jobs away at the moment. It's taking tasks away. And ultimately, I think companies who will do really well are the ones who understand the tasks that sit in each job and actually how they can redeploy people, how they can get more value. Because ultimately, the thinking goes, there'll be disruption to the job market, but new types of job will be created. Companies will get more value out of people, and it will all be all right in the end. And I kind of buy into that, but I'm not quite sure how long in the end away is. And how much sort of carnage we got in the middle. So I think that really understanding where AI can bring efficiency and value into your business isn't about getting rid of jobs wholesale. It's getting rid of parts of people's job. I think that's one of the things.
Now, I know you're an experienced podcaster, Matt, and somebody once told me you shouldn't mention the date or times in a podcast because they can live forever. But I have to do it. I have to break that rule. Last week was the Davos gathering, and I love the Davos gathering. It's where lots of rich people travel in private jets to discuss the climate degradation and social upheaval. But they never want to talk about taxing the wealthy. That never makes it to the agenda. However, Jamie Dimon, cool name, Jamie, well done, is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. Now, I don't know anything about his political stripes, but I'm guessing he's not a dyed-in-the-wool lefty or progressive. However, what he did say is that this change is not coming, it's here. And if the upside of the wealth that's created is not mitigated through government and business collaboration, there will be social unrest. So when the hard-nosed chief execs are saying things like that, something's changed. And he sounds like he sees the future. But as you just said, how many people are really ready for this? How many businesses are ready for these changes? And how ready is society?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is, governments tend to view this in terms of numbers. So it will be like, okay, well, AI has, eliminated 10,000 jobs, but we've created 11,000 jobs. And the problem is the jobs that have been created do not require the skills of the jobs that have been eliminated. And that's the problem. So I think people can look at the projections and go, oh, do you know, it's all right because eventually it will create more jobs than it destroys.
Yeah,
but there's just
right.
this massive skills gap around it. And I think that's the thing that we really need to be focusing on because, you know, and I can go on about this hours and hours and hours, but if you look at the way education systems work, they're still set up for a world that hasn't existed for 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
So who knows what, I have a 10-year-old son. When he hits the workforce in 8-10 years time, whenever it is, it's going to be very different, but he's still learning a lot of the things in a lot of the same way that I did when I was 10. And that's an issue.
So I was only a boy. I was only 8 or 9 when the miners' strike in Yorkshire kicked off. But I'm from East Yorkshire, so we had sympathy for what was going on in West Yorkshire, but we were observers. There's no coal fields in East Yorkshire. We used to be part of the North Sea, so we go fishing and stuff. And all of the debate at the time was, well, all you need to do is retrain. And it is such a ridiculously blasé approach. So if you're 50, you've been digging coal for forever, you've probably got health issues because of it, but your whole community, your rugby league team or your football team, and your identity is baked into your job. This idea to say, oh, you could just retrain, I think it's possibly the most obnoxious idea ever. And that has reappeared. You see, Mustafa Suleyman, he was the founder of Google's DeepMind. He now heads up AI at Microsoft. And he started off as a Labour politician here in London. There's no doubt about it. He's very intelligent. But he's talking about the superpower being flexibility and the ability to learn. And well, for an Oxford grad like him and a self-starter, yeah, sure, I'm sure he's a pretty good learner. But what do we do for the people who are below average intelligence, have neurodiversity challenges, are just not good at learning? We are not all great learners. And so, yes, he's right. If you're in that privileged position to be able to reskill and upskill and remain flexible, fantastic. But what do you do for the normal human beings, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think we're seeing some of the results of this at the moment. So there are, a huge amount of people who are sort of losing their jobs, who are in their late 40s, early 50s, late 50s, who've just done the same job for their whole career, and it's like that doesn't exist anymore. And what do they do? And it's not even that they can't learn new stuff. They're just, their mind is just not kind of focused on that because they haven't had to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a big issue. And I think also even when you talk about retraining and reskilling people, where's that actually happening? Who's actually providing
exactly?
Who's actually providing that? So yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue, and it's good to see that CEOs in big commercial companies are kind of flagging it up, because it's something that it's something that really needs to be thought of and really needs to be addressed, and it's not going to just sort itself out, I think, there.
Yeah. So when you and I first met, Matt, it was just after my book Visionaries, Rebels and Machines came out. I found myself back now in the turn of the last century. There was social unrest arising. For the first time, the rapacious elites in the United States, they were visualized as octopuses with their tentacles grasping everything. So people like Leland Stanford and people like Gardner Hubbard, who ran AT&T, these people were despised. And after a few years of these huge corporations hoovering up all the wealth, this was where the 1% quote came from, a 1904 book, that 1% of the families in the United States own 99% of the wealth. And so Theodore Roosevelt comes in and starts busting monopolies, and they start spending money on council works and municipal transportation, and none of them were progressives, but they didn't want a new civil war. Yeah, I think that's where Jamie Dimon's going with this stuff. Like, we've got to forget if you're left and right, this is just not right, and people will kick off. People will rightly express their anger if they, and it's not just about money, is it? It's also about dignity. Well, how do you, if you're unemployed and the stigma attached to that, how do you overcome that, and how do governments help people overcome that?
Yeah, and I think it's that transition period, because you have the likes of, I don't want to say his name, but you have the likes of Elon Musk putting stuff out there about, it doesn't matter because we'll live in this world where everyone has so much leisure. It doesn't matter about work, which is great for a trillionaire to start spouting. But it's like, what purpose do people have? but also how do we get there? What's the transition? And I think, again, you look at history, you look at the Industrial Revolution, lots of people will say, well, do you know what? It created more jobs than it got rid of. But there was this horrible transition period with, small towns being hollowed out, people, So I think it's, it's a big issue. I wish I had the answer.
I know. There's a fantastic book from Brian Merchant. He's a journalist from out in California. He runs a Substack page and he wrote this fantastic book. I think people don't, when they say, but the Industrial Revolution created more jobs than than it destroyed. Yes, true. How many children's limbs were mangled in the machinery? It was never ending.
Well. Yeah.
They called it the dark satanic mills, which wasn't an exaggeration. It was utterly flabbergasting how many people died, hundreds of thousands, how many communities were destroyed in the countryside. It was awful unless you were at the very, very top of that ownership structure. And I think most politicians, none of us want to go back to that again. We cannot let ourselves experience right now what we want to experience during the Industrial Revolutions.
Absolutely. So, I think, again,
on that happy note,
I'll be optimistic. I think that we will address these issues because they're becoming sort of more and more glaringly obvious. So, yeah,
I tend to agree with the optimism more or less because we do understand our own history. So we do understand the history of the Industrial Revolution, and we saw that we tried to mitigate inequality at the turn of the last century, but we failed, and that basically is what led to the Second World War and all the horror that came with it. I like to think that we've learned some lessons and we've built institutions that will help us this time around. I'm glad I'm nearly retired. Well, not nearly retired. I'm definitely closer to retirement than I am the beginning of my career. I think is that fair to say for you, Matt? You're not entry level anymore, are you?
I'm not entry level anymore. No, I'm kind of very much in. I don't know this stage of my career, whatever that looks like. But
autumn years. Let me now finish this interview, Matt, because I want to ask you. Speaking of youth and careers, what is your advice to young people entering their jobs right now? You've been around. You've guided thousands of people through their own career paths through your work as a consultant and a HR expert. What would you say to somebody right now who's maybe about to leave high school or graduate from university? What is the advice you can give them to get them off to a successful start with their careers?
So I think the advice is to probably ignore a lot of the other career advice that's out there. I think that we have to think about what is it that companies are going to find valuable in the future. And the World Economic Forum did a report on this, and some of the things that they sort of flagged up were creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, agility, curiosity. So I think that flexibility and curiosity are really what people need to think about. I think that one of the most exciting things about my career is I really sort of grew up during the internet revolution, and I got my first digital job in 1999, and it was just intense. And it was almost like everything that we believed to be true one day was not true the next day because of the way that technology was evolving. So I kind of really encourage people to be sort of very curious and not necessarily set on a very specific career path, because that career path might not exist anymore. So I think being flexible, being curious are probably the best things that people can do right now, and not kind of just really sort of fixate and limit your your choices by narrowly focusing on one particular area that could be sort of transformed within your first few years of working in it.
Brilliant. On that note, then, let me thank you, Matt, for those parting words, and thank you so much for this wonderful interview. Will you come back in 6 or 12 months' time to give us an update on where the world's at?
Of course. Happy to. Very happy to.
Then I will look forward to that as well, Matt. So thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching Container Solutions TV. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on YouTube and follow Container Solutions on LinkedIn for cut down parts and weekly clips. If you want help with platform engineering, cloud native transformation, or you need to follow the money in order to change how you operate your cloud at scale, then visit our website using the links below and get in touch. We'll see you in the next episode.